travelogue that we are studying together. Now, as I keep on suggesting, that Chai Chai has a certain structure, as it were, in terms of its, as it were, writing. Now, what is this specific kind of writing like? What is the specific kind of structure like, as it were? Firstly, there's the structure that that BG creates for himself. He talks about the metropolitan center from where the traveler, as it were, travels for a short distance, arrives at the destination, and then randomly, and this is very important, that he randomly enters into the town that he wants to go. Right. So there's a certain amount of randomness involved, and there's a kind of a restriction that he puts. It's almost 2 days, max 3, that he spends at this particular kind of place. So it's a very hurried visit, hurricane visit rather. It's a random visit. He does not know, or he hasn't planned it as yet. So it's a kind of an unplanned encounter. Then he goes out and he takes on the guise of the tourist here, and almost many of the sort of assumptions of the tourist, that everybody out there, from the auto rickshaw puller to the rickshaw driver, is about to fleece him. And therefore he's on his guard. He hunts for a hotel, which very frequently he sort of is not satisfied with. Either they are oil-stained sheets, or there are dirty bathrooms, or there are seedy locations. And therefore, he complains about it, he cribs about it. And then he moves out and has the local food, finds out what is the local delicacy, and very importantly goes to a local bar, engages with the local population, and tries to find out the anecdotes and the kind of accounts of the place. How does it derive its name? Who are the famous personalities? What are the places to visit? And he has a series of encounters, not really with the places, which are not really seen as important as themselves, the destinations, but the people that make up the destination. So, he will, of course, in Mughalsarai, will be talking about Pahari Baba and what he feels about Pahari Baba. And there are also, located around these particular small towns, destinations which are more touristy. In that sense, from Mughalsarai, he travels to Banaras, and from, he also travels from Jhansi, he travels to Khajuraho. So these are, touristy destinations which he will visit once he has arrived at that particular place. So, and then he spends 3 or 4 days, comes into contact with these people, and finally leaves the destination with a certain kind of, having gathered a certain kind of empirical experience. So on the one hand, there is a tendency towards an empirical record of whatever happened to him. On the other hand, these travelogues are very deliberately extremely impressionistic in the way that he seeks or searches for the kind of impressions, personal experiences that he has had during these travelogues. So it's very interesting in the way in which, on the one hand, there is a tendency towards minute description. On the other hand, there is, a kind of very strong personal feedback that he brings from these travels. So when we talk about the extent to which the travelogue is a real travelogue, is a real record, and the extent to which the authorial prerogative and the authorial sort of gaze is present, both of them seem to be equally present within the travelogues. Now, interestingly, let me also now, therefore, what I'll do here is take every single part of the travelogue and try to familiarize you with important segments from these travelogues, which I think, in many ways bring out certain critical aspects of the texts. Now, he begins with a prologue and subtitles it, Tiny Towns, Jumbo Junctions. Very interesting word that he uses. So, in terms of the railway map of India, the places that he visits, and this entire book has a map which I'm sure many of you have seen. This is the map that he sort of creates for himself, where he outlines which are the places that he visits. So it's Banaras, Jhansi, Mughalsarai. These are the three in northern India. And then he talks about Guntakal, Arakkonam, Jolarpettai, and Shoranur in southern India. So these are jumbo junctions, important because they are milestones in railway travel. Yet they are, in that sense, very small towns. So his intention is to sort of treat or take a peek behind these jumbo junctions and look at the smaller towns of India. Right. He then talks about the places that they take you through. It's talking about the romance of the railways, deep-rooted, unexpected halts at small stations, and also reality. Now, that's important. You see, these issues about, hotels, the issues about the food that he eats, the issues about the travel, the comforts, are all creature comforts that any traveler also engages in. So the travelogue is also simulating, in certain ways, the actual travels that we take. See, when we go to a hotel, the first thing that we check out is whether the bathroom is clean, whether it has cleaner sheets, whether women are safe or not. So in that sense, the persona of the traveler, the I, and this is written in a very strong first person, the persona of the traveler takes on as it were, the Aam Aadmi tourist. Now he's like you and I, our surrogate who looks at these basic creature comforts within the hotel and the city and the itinerary and the people and the cleanliness and so on and so forth. So very strong semblance with reality, identification with the traveler. And then he talks about, and of course, in the new prologue that BG has written, he's a little defensive about containing too many episodes of my drinking in local bars. See, another thing that BG really does is, he also takes on this kind of a persona of the cool young traveler. See, he's middle-aged. He's identified himself in many of his blogs as this middle-aged traveler, yet who's in the sense non-judgmental and extremely, open, in the sense that there is this, he could sort of talks about himself as a reluctant vegetarian, but he's also this cool dude who can, have a peg or two with his friends. He talks about how there is a frown on social drinking, as it were, but he finds that the bars are, almost magnets to which he's drawn, primarily because the local bar is the place where he can have a flavor of the local people. But the only thing that he would later on say, and this is something which I quote from his new preface, which comes out in November 2014, is that bars are where strangers open up and talk, and where you most often get the flavor of the town. And then, this is very interesting. He says, today, if I were to write Chai Chai over again, I would do it differently. So now he's thinking about alternative narrative methods. And what I see, he's talking about this book, is a work that is labored in trying to impress. So in a certain sense, BG is probably talking about this, deliberate kind of attempt to reach out to people and trying to force the encounter. One of the primary reasons for that is the amount of time that he spends. He's rushing from one destination to other, as it were, one landmark to the other. So he does not spend any real time He cannot afford to do that. So probably if he'd, and he wrote in one of his interviews that he would probably like to put some more time in these places, know these places more intimately. So there is an accusation which BG is kind of probably acknowledging, is that there is a certain degree of, superficiality here in the way in which there's a kind of sweeping and very hurried encounter that BG makes with the place. But then he's also talking about the tanginess, the instant gratification that this travelogue also gives. And it's also important for you to now understand that, when we encounter places, we are all essentially like BG in the tourist circuit. We spend very little time at a place. We look at it with the tourist's gaze along a fixed itinerary, and we try to take in, the attractions of the place, and we try to take in the pleasure of the place, as it were. And nowadays, of course, you even don't look at the scenario. You would probably want to create a selfie and preserve it rather than looking at it. So this instant gratification, this kind of pleasure of the place and transmitting it for the reader, is something that BG is acknowledging as himself doing. And he's saying that, part of the handicap of the book is the lack of time. It would have been, he says, a far greater book, a far thicker book with many more anecdotes. At the same time, the book functions also because it caters to this kind of instant gratification, certain sweeping generalizations that he makes, and therefore is also very tourist friendly. Tourist friendly, not in the sense that he's describing a tourist place, but he's also traveling in terms of the tourist, as it were, not lingering on any particular place. And then, of course, he talks about the jumbo junctions. I have already talked about some things which he sort of states. One, that railway stations are like fiercely independent states that he suggests. Very interesting. Later on, he will say that temporarily when the train stops, you are a temporary citizen of that state. So, state within the state, and the railway stations as autonomous places. And very importantly, because they are all homogeneous in terms of their build and their signage, therefore, they create a kind of a homogeneous India for all of us, but these are independent states. And also because, in many of these railway towns, the station is the capital. The station is the capital of that state, around which the entire mechanism of that place moves. He then talks about the railway as the symbol of national integration, which I mentioned, that the railway reservation form does not ask you anything other than your name, age, and also makes another very interesting comment that, traveling into another location is not just merely about individuals traveling. Also, it is traveling into culture, and cultures traveling into one another. So one of these markers that he suggests is food. And you will find that, in the 3 episodes that we'll be talking about, we'll talk about Mughalsarai, we'll talk about Jhansi, we'll talk about Itarsi. He's talking about the specific food. And he does not mention the hotel food, which is uniform. Anywhere that you go, a hotel will probably serve you chili chicken and chow mein and so on and so forth. But the street food, which makes it, unique. Now, even me, when I go to places nowadays, I go into the local supermarket, try to find out the local spices, the local chutneys, the local pickles, and so on and so forth, so that I can bring in a degree of authentic taste of that place. BG is much more adventurous than I am. He's got a better constitution. I would have died out of, indigestion. But he's adventurous in the sense that he takes up these local food. And then he talks about the railways as the circulatory system of India, and these places as the kind of valves where, things are recharged. And he talks about these junction stations because at one point of time, the Indian railway network was not as vast as it is now. So people would, have to change trains. So if you were going from one part of India to the other, you might have to get down at Jhansi and take another train. So these train stations became, landmarks in our personal histories, right? Say, for example, if you remember, you won't remember, your father and grandfathers would probably remember that you had to travel to Darjeeling, you had to get down at Malda, cross the river, and take another train. So, Malda became that kind of a junction station, which, was etched in their personal lives, as it were. So everybody has a touch of Malda within them if they travel to Darjeeling. So these are stations, for example, Guntakal, on the road between, say, Madras and and Bangalore, for example. So these would be important jumbo junctions, but very small towns. So that contradiction between its importance on the railway map and its actual, life beyond the railway station, right? And then he talks about Itarsi, which he will later on call the navel of India, which divides India into the north and the south. And he will identify, that is BG, will be identifying two distinct cultures, food systems, habits of discipline within, these two states. So the Vindhyas are a kind of a barrier on the two sides of which lie two Indias, as it were. Now, my question for you is, this is something which you need to ponder. Is BG falling into a trap of generalization? When he talks about the North and the South India as essentially different Indias, is there a trap of generalization that he's falling into? I would say, is South India so very homogeneous? Is North India so very homogeneous? Right? These are questions, we need to sort of keep at the back of our minds. And then he talks about these small towns, which are, even though we've all known about them, these are non-existential in our daily life. So his aim, as he says, is how does Itarsi, the town, look like? So how do these small towns look like? So at the end of the day, and I've written this in my notes while I was reading it, why not get off these junctions for a change and wander out of the station yard into the towns and listen to the stories they might be waiting to tell, instead of standing on the platform and looking out for the man calling chai chai? I've written for myself, so it's not about the chai at all. The chai is the point of departure. It is not an hiatus, a kind of interruption on a straightforward railway journey that BG is engaged in. It is an incursion into that space, into that gap, and trying to trace what these railway junctions and therefore small town India would look like. Right? That's the preface that I discussed. Now let us take the first train and go over to Mughalsarai. Of course, BG is squarely, implicating Mughalsarai as part of his childhood, as it would be to anybody who would be traveling to Eastern India and to North India regularly when they would be coming back home or visiting their relatives. Right. Now, obviously, as I say, the first step is that he's randomly sort of moving, in the sense that he's decided he's going to Mughalsarai, he's made a train booking, but he's done nothing else. So he's almost an atomic individual who has got down at Mughalsarai station. And then, also, you see, he will go to places with preconceptions, with preconceived notions. So, the preconceived notion that he goes to, and he classifies, UP and Bihar as these two states of lawlessness, that Mughalsarai, he has heard, is a town which is marked by violence, as it were, and crime. So these are crime zones. So that's his, and also, a question that is sort of creeping in the back of his mind is how communal is Mughalsarai, in the sense because northern India had seen, very devastating communal riots in the decade that in which BG is writing. Also important is that BG talks about his defense as a tourist, as it were, as a traveler. He assumes that all the local people are trying to con him or trying to swindle him, and therefore he takes on a defensive position. This he does not talk to the first rickshaw puller that he meets. And if you've landed at Bolpur station and you've seen how rickshaw pullers can sort of fleece people, so he takes on these defensive mechanisms. He tries to penny pinch, he tries to save his money. So interestingly, he immediately endears himself, this narrative persona immediately endears itself as an alter ego of what we are as tourists when we land at a particular place. Also important in BG is the way he's bringing synesthesia into travel writing, in the way that travel is not merely about the sight. It is about the sound of a place, the noises made. It is about the smell of a particular place. So he's bringing in this place alive through a depiction synesthetically of the sights and the sounds and the smells, the sounds that you hear at a particular location. And therefore, he's trying to, at this point of time, infuse an uniqueness into Mughalsarai. Of course, there's this entire adventure of finding an hotel in Mughalsarai. He searches, he does not find a good hotel, and then he lands up in a seedy hotel called Devi Lodge. And Devi Lodge has this hotel, which is a hotel which has a leaking bathroom, which has unclean laundry and bed sheets. And then comes a moment, very interesting moment, that when he's landed in Mughalsarai, when he's not finding a hotel, when he's reached Devi Lodge, he's sort of somewhere sort of talking to himself and saying, it serves you right for having not made reservations, serves you right for having not planned ahead. So it's something that we do very occasionally, talk to ourselves, mock ourselves. So there's an intense self-consciousness within this journey. Every time that BG is landing up at a place, he's also taking a journey not into these railway towns. He's also taking a journey within himself. What is he? How would he react? What is his gaze like? Right, there is, of course, there are these memories that he has of his personal encounters which encroach into the travel narrative. So it's a journey into a particular town. It's also a journey into his past, trying to sort of configure this small town in terms of his own memory. And as I pointed out, you see, the divided self of BG. On the one hand, he's coming here as a metropolitan reporter from a large city. At the same time, there is a core of the small town person within him who can relate these small towns with his own personal existences. Right, so the encounter with the self is also an interesting part of this particular travelogue. Right, so right now he says, I had only murderous mosquitoes and the sound of a leaking tap for company. Right, so, big junction, Mughalsarai, small and seedy lodge where he has ended up. And then he sort of wonders how, Mughalsarai got its name. Was it from Jahangir? Was it from Sher Shah Suri? Or was it from Aurangzeb? He wonders how, this place got its name, and he cannot sleep because there's load shedding, and he then strives out into the early morning and comes to Eton. Now, these places are very important landmarks in BG's travels. The eatery and the drinking house. Interestingly, the drinking house seems to be uniform across India, with people, coming in different dresses and languages, but they are almost always working class people inhabiting these drinking houses. But the eateries really are, and the same brands of wine are available, whiskey and Smirnoff and so on and so forth. But the interesting part is these eateries identify and very characteristic of a particular place. So at this point, in Mughalsarai, it's the puri sabji and the aloo matar that he'll talk about, rice and aloo matar. And he says it's a very simple dish, yet it has a kind of an universal appeal. So, the way in which puri sabji becomes the denominator for Mughalsarai, in the way that, the magoda becomes, the indicator of Jhansi. And of course, the moongfali and the chat and the samosa become symbols of Itarsi. Now, the samosa and the puri sabji therefore become northern Indian specialties, while the idli and the dosa are going to become markers of South Indian culture. So once again, traveling cultures differing, encounters of a northerner with a southern. Who is BG really? Is born up and brought up in North India. He identifies himself at home in South India. He's a Bengali by birth. So this very liminal state that BG actually projects, this cosmopolitan Indian who is simultaneously at home and alien at all places, is a very endearing and a very fascinating subject position that BG takes. And then, he talks about the small town there. And very importantly, there is this, he asks, what has changed? And he asks this receptionist, and the receptionist says something very interesting. And he says, "Aajkal ladies logo ko shringar karne ka shauq hai." And then BG asks, the way in which small town India, and we've talked about the aspirations, we've talked about the imitation or a standardization of these small towns in the ways in which we buy branded clothes. And one of the things that he takes a look at is the concept of looking good, which had percolated inevitably to the small town. Why should it be the preserve of the big city anyway, asks BG. Face pack is today as almost common as toothpaste, right? So, aspirational India in the way in which it seeks to enter into a negotiation with global capital and global branding, and how, the aspirational Indian seeks to participate in a post-colonial modernity is something that BG also in flashes. You see, this is very interesting. How does the travelogue function? The travelogue functions on the one hand as a meticulous record of his empirical encounters. So empiricism. On the other hand, there is a significant impressionist motive of the author's own personality encroaching. And the third is that within this narrative, there are certain patches where he makes comments about, small towns, about India, is making general philosophical comments about a particular place dying, for example, Banaras. So, in between there are certain patches where the traveler wanders into sociology, philosophy, and these are broad-based ways in which we talk, isn't it? You might talk about, say, for example, the way in which a footballer like Eriksson suddenly, sort of collapses on the ground, and then you immediately can talk about how life is very uncertain. What BG does is he makes it place specific, travel specific. Right. And then he talks about the internet and its non-availability in Mughalsarai, and how it therefore functions as a quasi sort of non-modern place. And then he goes back to the Indian bar. This is an important, always an important location in BG's travels. And he says that society looks down upon clandestine, upon drinking, and families consider as taboo. So such bars are the only place where you can drink in peace without burning a hole in your own pocket. And these are, bars which are really cheap. going by the rates that BG has given. And then he encounters this people, the Babu, who is into the business of marble slabs. And then he has these conversations with him about how Mughalsarai, how much of communalism there is in Mughalsarai. And he's astounded to find out that the Babu, whom he has sort of talked with, is actually a Muslim. And the same is true about, the Hindus whom he meets, and they confess that Mughalsarai is a place without any major, communal conflagration, unlike, say, a place like Varanasi, which would have the very, very havoc riots in the 2010s. Right. And then, there are anecdotes here where, where a person sort of lifts up chili chicken from someone else's plate. And these are, small comic passages which really add and create a flavor about his travels. This is what life is all about, little moments of, pleasure, comedy, grief, and so on and so forth. And then he talks about how very quickly within the bar, people almost all fall over him to sort of save him from that seedy hotel, and how they promise that they will meet and talk about and help them off immediately. But once they've left the bar, right, you make friendships on the train, and these train friendships very seldom, as it were, keep up in later life. But let me come back to Mughalsarai. What are the things that he then goes to Mughalsarai and tries to find out? He finds out who the important people of Mughalsarai are historically, and therefore he talks about Lal Bahadur Shastri, who was born and educated here, and he goes to Inter College, where he finds out that there might be a plaque only in memory of Lal Bahadur Shastri, but there's actually no real presence of Shastri in Mughalsarai. So in that sense, he's suggesting that, the historical India, and this is an important trope in his travelogue, is that the historical India of the pre-independence has made way for a new India, where really people like Lal Bahadur Shastri have no, reference. And it's also very interesting that nobody in the Mughalsarai seems to accurately know who exactly or why exactly, it got his name. And the shopkeeper come journalist that he goes to, he informs him that in the 16th century, when Humayun's army was on its way to Sasaram to fight Sesha Shuri, it had camped in Mughalsarai, and therefore the name was given. Also important is that he looks for Mr. Kapahi, who's a RSS member, and he tries to find out that, Deen Dayal Upadhyay was found murdered in Mughalsarai, and he desperately seeks out, the episode where, Deen Dayal was murdered, and Mr. Kapahi, being a very young RSS member, had actually visited the station where Deen Dayal Upadhyay's body was lying, and how people like Atal Bihari Vajpayee and Goalkar and the others had rushed in later on. But you see, what again filters out is that, there's no real interest in these episodes any longer, any real interest in Deen Dayal Upadhyay. Of course, now, Mughalsarai has been named Deen Dayal after him. But you see, this kind of lack of interest about the past and a more engagement with the present. So we are really talking about two Indias, one which is the pre-colonial, immediate post-independent India of pledges and commitments, and the new, as it were, post-globalized India of aspirations, achievements, and dreams. So in that sense, Mughalsarai, Lal Bahadur Shastri, Deen Dayal Upadhyay are caught within this kind of a movement where they've been cast into, as it were, the history, which really has no relevance for this people. Now, interestingly, the man whom we could actually see as a kind of paradox of modern India is Pahari Baba. Now, he encounters this man, Pahari Baba, remember, goes to the Hanuman temple. He has a evening sort of chat with Pahari Baba, finds out that he lives very frugally, and he's actually been a kind of a constable in the railways, and he's sort of been thrown out because of indiscretion that he had committed, some corruption, bribery, or something like that. And therefore, Pahari Baba has now become a saint, doesn't want to talk about his past, and he lives frugally, he worships the deity, and a man of 80, he looks like a man of 60. Now, here is an interesting man in this kind of travel, which embodies the paradox of India, as it were, the aspirational India, which looks at face packs and sort of making oneself pretty and trying to go to the largest city, and this quaint little Hanuman Mandir where people come as devotees and stick to their original traditions, where the Pahari Baba becomes very important. Ironically, a man who has ended up as a saint because he committed a theft, right? So the paradox of this, religion, transformation, and the way in which the two Indias, the older India and the newer India, as it were, exist side by side, is something that is quite fascinating, something that comes back and forth, in Chai Chai. Now, of course, then he talks about Mr. Kapahi, the man who found Deen Dayal's body, or rather who first saw Deen Dayal's body, and then as a young RSS activist was impacted. But once again, Deen Dayal is now enjoying a pension. I'm sorry, not Deen Dayal, but Mr. Kapahi is now enjoying a pension, which is started by the Samajwadi Party, and so on and so forth. So politics, remember, does encroach into Chai Chai only fleetingly. In fact, in a certain way, he does not, BG does not want to talk about politics to that extent really within the text proper. Why does he not want to talk about it is something we will discuss later on. Now, after that, you see, the kind of stories or anecdotes that Mughalsarai has to offer then very quickly dries up. And BG is in a hurry, as it were, to escape from Mughalsarai into Banaras. And he goes and visits the Kashi Vishwanath temple. On the route, he has rasgulla, or rather returning, he has a rasgulla and aloo paratha. And his, these are very common incidents that he says. He visits the Kashi Vishwanath temple, and as many of you would know, the monkeys take off and rob him of his puja kathali, and so on and so forth. And he sees Manikarnika Ghat and the Dashashwamedh Ghat, and the places where people are bringing in the dead to burn, to be cremated. And therefore he's impacted by these thoughts of life and death. BG, of course, will later on sort of cremate his own mother at Banaras, and this will provoke an entire travelogue on Banaras, which I might talk about a little in the concluding class. But it talks about how Banaras is sanctified the moment, he says, you identify the river and the town, Ganga and the Banaras, the earth under your feet becomes worthy of worship. Unlike other places whose history is measured in years, Banaras has defied time. Its history is as enchanting and as entwined with that of the gods. So eternal in the way in which some cities are historically determined. Say if you go to a place like say Fatehpur Sikri, it is warped in time, or say Khajuraho. Yet at the same time, when you go to Banaras, it is strangely alive, and it is sanctified as a place which, as it were, is beyond time. Right, so that then is Banaras for you that he talks about. And there is also within BG's travels particular references to money, how he's overcharged at the hotel in Banaras, how much he pays for an auto rickshaw later on, how much he pays for a rickshaw puller later on. So these small little empirical details also add to the authenticity of the travel narrative. Now, the next point, he moves on to Jhansi. And interestingly, if Banaras is a train to childhood, then Jhansi is defined in terms of Kama country, in the sense that Jhansi is really defined in terms of Khajura, right? And he arrives in Jhansi and he sort of has this expectation that, these government, within the government quarters, somebody will come in and invite him for coffee. And he talks about the chalk that every small town has. In Bolpur, you'll have the Dalal Emporium kind of a chalk where roads divide, which is the central point of the city, as it were. And then he lands up with Vikas Saxena, his classmate. Luckily finds him. Once again, notice the randomness within the travel. He does not plan to meet him. He just comes and encounters him, goes to a good hotel this time. The quality of the hotel is very important for BG, especially clean sheets. Once again, this metropolitan self-hood that he's talking about, unlike the smaller town people, he is very particular about air conditioning, very particular about prim and proper toilets, clean bed sheets, towels. He buys Medimix, soaps, a razor, aftershave, very importantly. So the metropolitan individual, he identifies himself as that metropolitan individual, and therefore he's essentially an alien, somebody who's gazing into this small town. Right, and then he asks the local inhabitant about Jhansi, and he says, "Chota sa shahar hai, kya rakha hai yahan?" So it's a kind of approach that is also taken about by the younger brother whom he encounters at the dhaba, Bhagat. And Bhagat says, a small town, people just dream about passing on the time. There is no aspiration, and so on and so forth. So almost uniform small town mentality that BG is talking about. Right, he then travels across the city and comes across the chaatwala. So if it was puri and sabji in Mughalsarai, it's the chaat in the city of Jhansi. He talks about golgappas and he voraciously eats pani puri. And he talks about the lure of street food as a kind of prohibited food, which therefore is so very attractive. And then immediately he asks Jagat, the dhabawala who's making Afghani chicken for him, who's the friend of Vikas, whether he dreamed of working in a big city like Delhi. And you see how immediately Jagat jumps at the offer. Why? Do you have a job in mind for me in Delhi? He asked with utmost seriousness, perhaps mistaking my question for a veiled offer. And he once again asked, why? Do you have a job for me? So this aspirational aspect of migrating from the smaller city to the larger city, right? This kind of naivety as well as a kind of aggressive energy that he has is something that will be later on explored in some of the films that we talked about in the first class. So the younger brother Bhagat, on the other hand, who runs a coaching class and not a restaurant, he says, in a place like this, people don't aspire for too much. They are happy with what they have. If someone is earning 15,000 rupees a month, he's satisfied. This is enough for me. Why do I need more? So a kind of a comparison between the kind of living standards of the metropolitan city and the smaller city. One of the classifications of Itarsi is that it is the land of sastai, or cheap quality. Bolpur has this very strange word which flummoxed me at first. They say koma jinish, so koma dam, so cheaper price, cheaper goods. So that is again an interesting aspect that BG hones in on, the kind of economic life in the smaller city when compared with the economic life of the bigger city. So once again, caught within a kind of a time warp, within a kind of a pre-capitalist, pre-branded world that BG mentions. And then he travels to Orcha, and his auto breaks down. And then there is a very interesting passage which I find reveals a lot about BG. He says, I went across the road and stood under a tree. I could have spent the rest of my day. I have always been curious about a farmer's meal, but I think I know what he eats. He's sort of trying, it's this metropolitan gaze, metropolitan selfhood who's trying to imagine himself as a farmer. 5 or 6 rotis with a little dal and a large onion, or maybe just the rotis and the onion if he's very poor. So, it's BG and the farmer are miles apart. He knows really nothing, but he's imagining himself about what the farmer might imagine. So this gulf between the selfhood of the metropolitan individual, who is condescendingly looking down at the farmer and what he eats, is this difference between the two Indias that we're talking about. The one India which is entitled, which is richer, which is more endowed with resources, and the other which is impoverished yet aspires to break through. And once again, everywhere that BG goes, he gives us the rates of the bar. In this particular case, he does not talk about a lot about the bar people, but then he then talks about loyalty when he encounters people who've come to Khajuraho and Orcha from Tamil Nadu. And he says, loyalty can be so disloyal at times. Here I was, savoring the back home feelings in the terrain of Uttar Pradesh, after having lived in Chennai for 7 years now. And yet the moment I hear Tamil being spoken in the land I was born, I start feeling at home. Now that is a paradox, isn't he? He's a North Indian by upbringing, a Bengali by birth, a Tamilian, a South Indian in terms of professional sort of location. And yet he says, whenever I hear Tamil being spoken, even in northern India, I feel home. So it's this paradoxical liminal selfhood that BG that is very interesting. Now he travels, of course, to Ranchi, through Ranchi, and he goes to Rani Lakshmibai temple. There's very little history that he talks about. He briefly mentions Dhyan Chand, who was another important resident of Jhansi. So every city has these unique people whom you love to talk about. And he talks about the kind of the site from which Jhansi, the Rani of Jhansi, jumped. And he gives us certain platitudes about, the bravery of the Jhansi wali Rani, khoob ladi mardani wo to Jhansi wali Rani thi. There's almost a casual dismissal of this episode, as it were. There's no historical account. There's no real attempt to consider what the colonial or how Jhansi, the Rani of Jhansi, might have fought the colonial, what the child would have sort of thought about. There's almost a kind of very casual glossing over this history, and how he's more afraid of the monkeys snatching his things. So quite obviously, BG is not a great history man in terms of his travels. He's not trying to say, like Dalrymple, sort of move into historical details, travel across histories. He's much more interested in what it means for Jhansi right now. And then he, as a tourist does, he also buys these small mementos, a pocketbook of Jhansi, as it were, of the Jhansi, of Lakshmi Bai, and so on and so forth. For him, then, he says, for me, Jhansi was now an air-conditioned room with a clean, comfortable bed on which I was to sleep and dream of my trip to the land of Kama Sutra. So once again, that metropolitan selfhood and that metropolitan gaze, there is a degree of superficiality, I think, which is working through the travels. Right. And then there's this Raju the guide, almost reminding us of Mulk Rajanand's, R.K. Narayan's The Guide, and Raju, sort of being the guide. And he goes to Jahangir Mahal, where he sort of desperately wants to take a photograph of him behind the grandeur. And there's one episode which I find very, very crucial. It's a kind of a episode which suddenly impinges upon the text without any real context, as it were. and he goes to the river Betwa, and the river is dry, and you have the rocks in the background of which a young woman is disrobing and trying to bathe. And he says, I quickly reasoned, if she had no problems disrobing in public view, what was mine? So he's wondering whether he should watch it. He says, once the sari came off, she undid the petticoat, pulled it up to cover her breasts, after which she skillfully removed her blouse. And here I was, pointlessly debating whether to watch as to not. She was obviously a regular bather and knew how to protect herself from my prying eyes. I suddenly noticed Raju. He was standing at a respectable distance. I wondered if he had noticed me look at the woman. The thought of it embarrassed me a little, but then what the hell? Now, interestingly, this will come back later on also. When he's looking at the sculptures in Khajuraho, now BG's gaze, as it were, is a very urban male gaze, where this village girl is a kind of female object to look at. There is a certain gender bias within BG's writings, where he looks at in terms of the woman as being an object of the male gaze. This is a perfect example of how the male gaze can operate in fiction. Although BG, to grant him, is very conscious about his male gaze, is quite embarrassed about it, but then it is there. And part of the travelogue, importance of the travelogue, is the confessional motive. BG does not hide himself. He's not politically or in terms of the sexual politics of the travelogue. He's not somebody who kind of puts on a political correctness. He is franker. There's a certain degree of exposure of the self. There's a candor and a certain amount of expression of personality, as it were. And this is what makes the travelogue so very intimate, as it were. So the travelogue is, in many senses, a memoir which provides us an account of BG's self as well. Now, then he joins this entire tourist circuit to go to Khajuraho, of course. And he sort of goes there early morning and feels like a voyeur caught peeping into a neighbor's bedroom. And he looks at the different, and this part of the travelogue, I think, is rather flat, in the sense that he gives more or less a traveler's account of Khajuraho, looking at the different positions and the different kind of orientations that the sculptures depict. But very interestingly, there is the guide's words: lust converts to love, love converts to devotion, devotion converts to spirituality, spirituality converts to super consciousness, and so on and so forth. So at Khajuraho, he is more or less a tourist who is clicking photos by the sides of these exotic, as it were, positions, and is looking at the different tourists, the Western tourists who are, extremely comically charged, but who have dignified smiles. And there are these platitudes: don't look at them in terms of don't give them dirty looks. They are works of art, and so on and so forth, right? And he buys, a pocket-sized Kama Sutra, and it's here that the travelogue to Jhansi actually stops. So in both these travelogues, there is the place that he visits, Jhansi, the small town, and then gravitates towards the larger, more important, as it were, tourist spot. So in that sense, both these travelogues begin at these railway junctions and then, branch off into more touristy places. But it's described the people, it's described the landmarks, it's talked about the history of the place, although very casually. He's encountered the anecdotes and the people somewhat. But once again, it's a very hurricane tour, as it were, 2-3 days, 2 nights, 3 days. So it's almost a kind of a tourist package, although you must take into cognizance the fact that he is very randomly looking at these places. Right. Okay. Now to come to the navel of India, Itarsi, and I'll be quick with Itarsi, really. Although Itarsi is one of the most important parts of the book, I invite you to take a very careful look at it, because he says that if you move from the north to the south, east to the west, Itarsi stands right at the middle of this, and Itarsi is the point from where northern India ends, Aloo Puri ends, Bonda ends, and you start into South Indian food and South Indian culture. Once again, he travels to the hotel, finds that it's a railway hotel, but it's not up to the mark. So he's pondering whether he should change the hotel or not. Itarsi is, of course, the railway town, because Itarsi has a siding. Itarsi is a place from where northern and southern trains very frequently you have to change over. But now, of course, he says that because there's no changing over, because the railway tracks and engines have improved, you straight away move. Therefore, Itarsi is gradually losing its importance in terms of the railway map. And then, of course, when he comes at Itarsi, he comes to Mahatma Gandhi Road, and the food that he talks about is the magoda, right? The pakoda and the magoda, which are a very important food in middle India, as it were, in Madhya Pradesh, right? Of course, then he talks about, once again, Itarsi and the bar. You have the 1980 film Love Story, whose song Yaad Aa Raha Hai, plays. And Itarsi, once again, is, as it were, caught in this time warp. It's once again a land where you have Bata and you have no malls, as it were. And then he talks about the railway station, which is the important landmark. He travels to the railway station. You remember, in the dead of night, he sees how the railway station is a sleeping place and comes alive only when an important train arrives. He meets the people, for example, the train driver, the engine driver, who's witnessed the Second World War, and how the steam engine has made way to diesel locomotives. So once again, Itarsi is about the railways and the presence of the railway town, as it were. Now, interestingly, there are anecdotes which he shares. This is the anecdote which I find very crucial in Itarsi, is this anecdote about Kelabai, whose husband has been, who has been bitten by a serpent, and she goes to the hospital, and then she's taken to the local temple, and then she starts to sway like Nagina, and then the people say that that she's brought to the local priest, and who says that there's a spirit who is actually sort of hovering on her, and then the spirit says that it is all a result because the husband is having non-veg food and drinking, and therefore the husband promises, and Kelabai is, as it were, freed from the curse of that snake bite. And of course, the presence of this report, newspaper report in Itarsi, is significant because what BG is doing here is presenting deliberately Itarsi as a kind of a pre-modern town, which has not yet had globalization, which is still rooted in the age of superstition, and where you do not have malls, you do not have great any kind of a landmark, as it were, and you have instead, he gives the description of a dharamshala where Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel had stayed, where Nehru had stayed, and which freezes these certificates from Nehru and Patel on the walls. So time, as it were, he suggests, has stopped in this small town. So it's still rooted and locked in the past, unable to move out of its past. And the people also in Itarsi are therefore given to alcohol, and the only kind of a profession which really is there in Itarsi is that of the railways. And he describes the railway sidings, He describes the railway yard, the engineers working around there. So in that sense, Itarsi is a town which has stopped in time, a fading railway town, important in terms of changeover at one point of time, but no longer significant in modern globalized India. It has been a place where freedom strugglers passed, but there's no ulterior history associated with it. It's one of those insignificant villages. Now, if you remember your Kanthapura, for example, it's one of those, indistinct spaces, villages of India, right, through which Gandhiji might have passed once. Therefore, it became a kind of folklore around the town. So around Itarsi, of course, the various people passed, gave certificates, but ultimately Itarsi by itself has no identity of its own. And then, of course, he talks about the old train driver, as I pointed out. He talks about the old ages and how there was imandari at this point of time, and how people would donate to others, keep chickpeas for the hungry, and so on and so forth. And he's on the verge of giving money to this person when he suddenly realizes that this person gets 7,000 rupees pension, which in Itarsi is quite a sum. So even it's an anecdote where even BG is stumped in his assumptions, as it were. Right. And there is another very interesting encounter that he has through his journalist friend Amandip Batra. It is about this woman, Manju, who apparently was a respectable woman once, but has fallen into prostitution. And this, once again, the framing of this episode gives us a kind of an index of how people change, and it's an anecdote, no doubt. But this interest in the woman, in the fallen woman, not so much in the drunken man, but in the woman who's been thrust into poverty, and how Manju is, sort of requested by Amandip to meet BG, who is, simultaneously embarrassed and at the same time quite thrilled to incorporate Manju into his narrative, is something very, very interesting, really, because once again it reveals within the narrative a kind of a deep, in a certain way, masculine bias, in that sense that BG is taking a look at this woman who should not really have been the subject of the gaze. But then he says, very interestingly, this was a strange encounter. It's a very patronizing kind, one of the episodes which I did not like about this book at all. But then, once again, this is what the encounter is all about. It does not only give you a picture of Manju, it also gives you a picture of BG in all its complexities, in all its weaknesses and strengths. People usually spend an hour with a human being who has turned into a prostitute. But I just spent an hour with a prostitute who is also a human being. Now, you see, when BG is writing that, and I do not know if he's sort of looked at it once again, that is horribly patronizing. To say that it's a prostitute who was also a human being is a horribly condescending, judgmental, and patriarchal statement to make. So, in a sense, the travelogue is also bearing BG to us. So, when we talked about, and we will listen to the theorists talking to us about travel writing. We've already invited Carl Thompson, and Carl writes about the travelogue, Paul Fussell, as the memoir, which the memoir does not reveal other people. It reveals also you. So in that sense, BG is also bearing part of his personality to us, right? And of course, the two important sites in Itarsi that he talks about, one is, of course, the railway yard, the railway station, and he talks about the when you take a train, you really rarely realize that it takes an army of 700 engineers to keep the engine in running condition. So it talks about these railway quarters, which we've all seen. If you go to Prantik station, for example, you'll find just across the station these railway quarters, right? So, the immense technical people who live so that, the train can run, the signal systems can move. So BG is giving us an idea of how complex the railway network is. I can tell you about, the history of the railway signaling system. I once went to a railway museum in New York, but I'll not do that because it's taken away from our topic. But the two places where BG visits one is this Hotel Nilam, which is famous for its food and how it sort of packages food now for the consumers in the train bogies. So they call Hotel Nilam up, and Hotel Nilam immediately supply them with food, and they revel in the fact that they are an ISO company. So, how, the town is also coping with modernity in its own way. And of course, there's this Tata market that is existing in a kind of an airport hangar, which is known as the Chaupal Bazaar. And he realizes when he goes there that it's a ITC hypermarket. It's run by the tobacco major, which diversified into the business of apparel. And this is where you see the small town is now facing the incursion of global capital in the way that ITC is making its way into these places. Very soon, Bolpur will have its own big bazaar. And then once it comes up, you will have these supermarkets and so on and so forth. Hypermarkets where you'll get everything, right? The mall will follow next. We've already have high rises, and the cities will gradually lose their small world charm and then become almost homogeneous, as almost all Mofussil towns of Bengal are gradually happening. So at ITC, at this ITC Chaupal Bazaar, he finds ready-made apparel, food, ready-made food, shoes, even Tata Sky and the dish antenna. And he finds that Tata Sky has entered there with the blessings of and the advertisements of Mahendra Singh Dhoni. Once again, realized that if railways is a very important part, then cricket too, television too is an important part. So Mahendra Dhoni promotes a particular brand of hair gel, and that too is a hit at Itarsi. So a kind of a homogenization, the entry of global capital into these smaller cities. BG is capturing at this point of time these anecdotes very, very carefully. You see, this part of the travelogue is again very, is told in a very nuanced way. It does not give you any overt comment. It just records this experience. But within the record of that experience lies an entire history of an incursion of capital into these small towns. And then as he moves away from the billing counter, he says, I found myself behind a short queue of women from nearby villages. As I waited for my turn, I wondered if one of them could be Kelabai. So at this moment when he encounters modernity encroaching into Itarsi, it is at that point of time that he's reminded of Kelabai, who is a symbol of the superstition, old word naivety of a pre-modern world. And you see, Itarsi becomes the symbol of that, town, of that railway town, which is caught within the time, within these two fluxes of time between modernity and tradition, between the past and the present, between globalization and a pre-globalized world. And it is here that you see a person like BG, who's sort of been there in the pre-global world and has also now is also a part of this metropolitan male gaze, is looking at Itarsi. So within these three travelogues, we've seen certain common methodologies of narration. Arrivals, hotel searching, dissatisfaction, traveling to certain spaces, going to the bar, meeting people, going to tourist destinations. You see, at Itarsi, he does not go to a tourist destination. He will not in the subsequent travels. And he's much more at home in these places right now. And therefore, he is he's writing about these places as caught between these liminal spaces of time, space, and personality, right? So it is therefore with these comments really that I would like to conclude this segment. He's described the three sites of northern India, these three stations of northern India, and now BG is ready to cross over from the Vindhyas and move on to the southern part of India. And we'll try and look at how he portrays southern India and whether these kind of as it were gazes, these kinds of common strategies of traveling, randomly entering in and searching for hotels, looking out at the bars, looking into places, rivers, spaces, holds out or not. So that is for tomorrow then. And we will look forward to your presence at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow when we cross over to the southern part of India and enter a small station called Guntakal. Right. So thank you very much for your presence, and I hope to see you tomorrow.